Hello and welcome to Riot Science Club Imperial. Thank you for joining me. For anyone who's new, the Riot Science Club was set up by Dr. Sam Westwood to raise awareness and provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open and transparent science practices. And it's going from strength to strength. The club now has thousands of followers and there are Riot's clubs at 6 different institutions. So one of the advantages of COVID and changes to our working practices is that we can now be global and anyone from anywhere can join, time zones permitting. And so give us a follow on Twitter and sign up for email alerts so that you don't miss out. All previous speakers and events are shared on the Riot Science Club OSF page and YouTube channel. So a bit of housekeeping before I introduce. Can join, and you may share this link publicly. Live events is a one-way streaming platform, so you can ask your questions in the Q&A message board, and these will be moderated by myself. So please keep your questions and comments relevant and respectful to today's talk. And I'll feed the speaker the questions at the end of the talk. So please monitor the Q&A and upvote any questions that you would like to be asked, and I'll prioritise the most popular. Finally, if you joined late, don't worry, you can pause, you can rewind, and you can fast forward. And live events also has an auto subtitling feature too that I've enabled in several languages. But if you have any other accessibility needs, please let me know and we'll see what we can do to help. So now on to our main event. We're honoured to have Professor Prof Curry with us. He's a Professor of Structural Biology at Imperial College London, where he also serves as the Assistant Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. So for many years, he's been a writer and campaigner on a range of scientific issues, including open access, research assessment, research funding and science policy. And he's currently chair of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA. So there isn't a week or a day that goes by where we in academia are not discussing research and research assessment. So today's talk is sort of builds upon the talk that we had last month from Professor Chris Jackson, which you can catch up on YouTube. So Professor Curry will be discussing DORA, which is a campaigning initiative to improve the ways that we evaluate research and researchers, and it aims particularly to call out the problematic nature of the over-reliance on aggregate metrics, such as journal impact factor in the assessment process. So he'll discuss the work that DORA is doing to promote and develop alternative and more holistic processes of research assessment. And how this sort of relates better to open scholarship and enduring issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. So I'll now hand over to Professor Curry.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is the second time that I've given a talk to a Riots Club. Actually, the first time was in about February last year at King's College London, and in the immediate aftermath of that talk, there was a worldwide pandemic, and I'm hoping that there won't be a similarly disastrous outcome to today's proceedings. But today I want to tell you about DORA and basically why it exists and what it's doing. My title is Rethinking and Re-engineering What We Value in Research. But really, my talk is framed around the sort of larger question of who is science for? Because I think this is a question that amid the hurly-burly and busyness of the day-to-day work of getting on in academia, we do sometimes lose sight of our larger purpose, and I think we impoverish ourselves when we do that. And unfortunately, many of our research assessment practices contribute, I think, to that impoverishment or loss of purpose. So one of the problems and one of the reasons that DORA exists is that we have allowed scholarly publishing to come into opposition to the public interest, because we have yoked it so strongly to career advancement, to funding decisions, promotions, etc., that in the chase for journal prestige, which is one of the sort of main items which is sort of calculated and enumerated in CVs and applications, means that academics then spend time chasing publication in top journals and ignoring then the primary purpose of their research, which is to better understand the world and hopefully to better serve the world. So this is an article I wrote back in 2016, around the time of the emerging Zika virus crisis, which had spread to South America and was implicated in this troubling condition of microcephaly among newborn children. And led by the Wellcome Trust, there was a coalition of funders and publishers who agreed to suspend our normal processes of scholarly publishing in order to address what was a very serious public health crisis. So what Wellcome did under their leadership, they got publishers to agree not to penalize any researcher who shared their results and their data as rapidly as possible online so that the worldwide community could come together and work the problem. Normally there was a perception that if you share data online, then it's regarded as a publication, and many journals had the practice of not then considering manuscripts that they considered already published. And what that shows you is that as a community, we had come to be prepared to accept delays in sharing the work that we do, which was clearly in the public interests, for the selfish sake of our own career advancement. Now that was an entirely rational thing to do, but it's of course deeply problematic. And I don't want you just to take my word for this. Other people have pointed out the problem of the fixation in academic careers of the published work. And again, this serves to undermine, I think, the broader purpose that we have. So here is Robert Insull, who for many years led the National Institutes of Mental Health Research in the United States, and he spent 13 years there pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when he looks back, they spent $20 billion and they succeeded in publishing lots of really cool papers. However, he continues, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, or improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. So we clearly have a problem in the way that we manage and recognize and reward research endeavors. We have, I think it's widely agreed, lost our way somewhere along the path. And that has happened, I think, to a large degree, not exclusively, but to a large degree because of the way that we use and abuse metrics in academic assessment and the way that we incentivize, what good research looks like. And it tends to look like research in so-called top journals and then performance metrics that get your university ranked in university league tables, which is largely driven by similar types of publication metrics. The methodologies vary, but each of them only really captures a very narrow conception of what is valued in terms of academic research. So things like impact factors and university rankings have become normalized. And even if you talk to university leaders these days, they may recognize the problematic nature of impact factors and the fact that, league tables are only really a narrow measure of a very broad and rich set of activities. But that will often be followed by a shrug of the shoulders, what can you do? And I think that fundamentally is the problem that we are here to address. Since you've already heard from Chris Jackson, you're probably aware, I hope, of many of the unintended effects of over-reliance on journal metrics and measures like league tables. So as we discussed with the Zika case, the chase for impact factors slows publication. That's not in the public interest. And it also, the practice leads to a highly positive bias in the literature because there are no places for sharing negative results. Journals are not incentivized to accept negative results because they suspect, probably quite rightly, that they won't be highly cited and that therefore it risks reducing the impact factor of the journal, which they use as a marketing tool to attract authors and readers. Those of us, of course, that work in academic research will recognize the hyper competition that seems to have become the norm, in which really the focus is on publishing in the right journals and getting in big grants are the activities that are most highly prized. But at the same time, what that's doing is devaluing many other important activities, and with them, academic life in itself. Activities such as mentorship of PhD students and postdocs who are the next generation of investigators. So we have a process of assessment that's very much focused on the what and not the how or the who. And these can lead, this focus on just the output helps to incentivize fraud, and we know that retraction rates correlate strongly with impact factors, and ultimately that will lead to an undermining of the reliability of the research record and of public trust. And that's a very dangerous thing to be doing, because we rely on public investment for a large fraction of research funding. At the moment, there is actually a high degree of public trust, as we've seen through the past year or 18 months. The scientific community has really helped enormously in addressing and tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess we are riding high. Nevertheless, I think this is not something that we as a community want to take for granted. There is a significant amount of work has gone on to look at the sort of cultural impacts of our focus on metrics, and this is a particularly interesting piece from Ruth Muller and Sarah de Rijke at the CWTS in Leiden, looking at the way that our obsession with metrics and with indicators actually changes the way that one approaches doing science. So their perspective is focused on understanding how researchers themselves gives value to research, and we internalize as a community the signals that we get from the system that manages our incentives. And as a result, they have demonstrated other norms and criteria for scientific quality, such as originality, long-term scientific progress, societal relevance, social responsibility, receive less attention or become redefined through their relations to quantitative indicators. We understand this trend to be in tension with policy goals that seek to encourage innovative, societally relevant and responsible research. So the system is very much in tension, and this academic research very much bears in mind, I think, some of the anecdotal evidence that many will be familiar with. These are two quotations that happened to me in real life, so these are real people that said these things. I have anonymized them. But one dean at a prominent university in the UK talked about our people know how to get the Nature papers. This is how we talk about what we value in research, and we use Nature papers as the defining goal rather than high quality research that helps improve our understanding of the world or helps to change it for the better. Or one postdoc who told me, I'm really excited, I just had a paper accepted by Cell. Okay, and so the first thing that she wanted to tell me was that she got a Cell paper. It wasn't about the actual science that went into the paper. So it really is changing the way we see research. It's reinforced here in this perspective written by Frank Miedema, who's been one of the sort of movers and shakers in this space. He's led a very important overhaul of research assessment at the University Medical Center in Utrecht. But again, he identifies a similar phenomenon to that identified by Muller and de Rijke. And so despite personal ideals and good intentions, which I think is what drew many of us into a career in research in the first place, our incentive and reward system, in this incentive and reward system, researchers find themselves pursuing not the work that benefits the public, but the work that gives most academic credit. And this, unfortunately, is the situation in which we find ourselves. Other unintended effects of this impact on the culture that we see within academia, which is putting a great strain on mental health and which is also a driver for toxic and bullying behavior which we need to absolutely get away from. And this is a sort of summary, a commentary by Jeremy Farrar, Director of the Wellcome Trust, on the occasion of publication of a report looking at research culture within the UK, but many of these messages will be recognizable all around the world. Okay, the relentless drive for research excellence, a fairly undefined quantity, has created a culture that cares exclusively about what is achieved and not about how it is achieved, and has resulted in this destructive hyper competition, toxic power dynamics, where we get an awful lot of unreasonable behavior, a culture in which, however unintentionally, it can be hard to be kind. And so this is where we have arrived at through no principle or design process, but this is the situation which we have to try and escape. And in order to think about how we might do that, and there are many people and organizations alongside DORA who are thinking about that, one of the more thoughtful sort of commentators, although he's not speaking specifically about the academic world, this is a talk by the philosopher Michael Sandel on a new politics of hope, and he's talking very much about politics in the wider sense, reflecting on the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, the vote in the UK to leave the European Union, and making the point that, you know, those votes were to a large extent driven by large fractions of the population who felt disenfranchised, disconnected from the globalized world, who had lost hope that actually our democratic processes had anything valuable or meaningful to offer them, and seeing that as a result of the influx of market economics, which began, I think, pretty intensively in the 1980s under Thatcher and Reagan in the US and the UK. And which, you know, puts a premium on markets and competition as a way of discovering value. And Sandel's conclusion or perception is that we need to begin to tell stories that frame politics around a genuine appreciation and social recognition for contributions to the common life and to the collective well-being, to the public good, in other words, and contributions furthermore that go beyond how the market rewards you and how the market defines the value of your competition. And we've seen what the influx of market values has had in academia, and we need to find ways to rediscover our sense of the common good and incentivize that. Sandel, furthermore, has written an excellent book called The Tyranny of Merit, which sort of amplifies and develops these themes, and which I can highly recommend to you. Now, Sandel's not the only one thinking about this, and the problems of our research culture have been discussed, have been analysed, and solutions proposed. And here is just a handful of a number of selected reports from over the years that have tried to address this issue. This from the Nuffield Foundation back in 2014. This is a report produced, and I need to declare an interest in here. I had a hand in authoring this. Which is produced by LERU, which is the League of European Research Universities, which is kind of like a high-powered European Russell Group. It's a very self-selecting group of research-intensive universities. There are 5 UK members, and Imperial College is one of them. This is the Wellcome report that I mentioned earlier, and this is the most recent contribution. Actually comes from the Russell Group, again self-selecting. But even if, you know, if the Russell Group and LERU universities are recognizing that there is a problem with research, that with our research culture, and that it very much does need to be addressed, and I think also then recognizing that our modes and mores of research assessment are a contributory factor to that, that's an encouraging sign. However, of course, these are just a bunch of words, and so, you know, what hope is there that actually these words will turn into action? And that's where DORA, I think, comes in as one of the participants. But of course, it's the system and the scientific and research community as a whole that needs to think about, you know, changing the way that it's doing things. Clearly, over the past year or more, there has been a very significant change and shift in the way that we have moved towards fast publication. So it didn't require this time a special initiative led by the Wellcome Trust. I think the community generally recognized the need, and so this is a summary of the papers that have been published as preprints. So they're not peer reviewed, but it's obviously a way of very rapidly sharing results. And there's been a total of 16,000 articles published on COVID-19 since about January 2020. So in just under a year and a half. And I think that has brought many new people, many new research groups to the practice of publishing preprints. So hopefully it will begin to shift the Overton window and it will come to seem normalized. But I think there is nevertheless a risk that, once the pandemic is over and we shift back to normal life, maybe the old habits will kick back in, because clearly, people behave in response to our incentive mechanisms. But I think it's certainly helped to change thinking in some minds, and hopefully that then prepares the ground for a more permanent shift. This is an interesting article which I think reflects to some degree something of that mindset. This is from Michael Gibbons, who used to work at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, and articulating that a new contract between science and society must ensure that scientific knowledge is socially robust, so that it serves society, and that its production is seen by society to be both transparent, i.e. Both transparent and participative, i.e. that it is actually a kind of open science. And I would very much commend this article to you, but you might be surprised to learn that it was actually first published in 1999, and so predates most of the declarations and definitions of open access, never mind the sort of more mature statements that we've had recently on what open science and open scholarship should look like. But at least the seeds were there. But it does strike me now whether we need a new social contract which defines the commitment to openness in even clearer terms. Within DORA, talking about our values and commitments to openness in all its forms, this is the vision that we would articulate for what quality research and what a quality research system looks like. And that would include reliable, rapidly communicated, accessible, i.e. open, high quality research that transforms our understanding of the world and can change it for the better. Researchers who collaborate, who feel a duty of care to group members and colleagues, helping to detoxify some of the behaviours that are part and parcel of the normal mode of operation, and a responsibility to the societies of which they're an integral part, and a research system that values the people within it, cares about their quality of life, and seeks out the creative vigour of diversity. Now, once again, like the reports that I referred to in a slide a couple of screens back, these are just words. So how do we go about realizing this vision in practice? It's a set of values that I think everybody can buy into. But again, we've got to avoid the shrugging of the shoulders and the resignation to feeling powerless in the face of the real politic of research and research assessment. And I think many of the practicalities can be centered around talking about open science and actually talking about how open science is actually better science, better serves the world and better serves the scientific community. Preprints are obviously already a part of that and a growing part. They clearly enable faster communication. I very much like the somewhat subversive idea that they've also snuck in, which is that within a preprint, the focus has to be on the content because there is no journal name to consider. So the focus on the assessment of the quality within the preprint has to be on the content, not the container. It is a practice that encourages open peer review, and that is a practice I would like to see adopted at more and more journals. Open access generally is, of course, growing, In fits and starts, we have seen sort of policy developments in the UK in 2012, 2013. We've seen the arrival of Plan S in a rather noisy and argumentative fashion. And it's still very much a work in progress, but open access generally creates a global audience. And by sharing it with as big an audience as possible, that increases scrutiny, and that can help to address the reliability then of the published record. Data and code sharing are natural outgrowths of the sort of shift towards preprints and open access, because it's about sharing and being able to reuse not just the published report, but the underlying data and the underlying code. And once again, of course, that increases the reliability of the published record. And open science, as I think we've seen, both in the Zika virus crisis and with the new coronavirus, not so new anymore, is better for changing the world. And if we can do it for, Zika with an initiative, we can change our practices for coronavirus, why would we not want to do it for other infectious diseases such as malaria, such as TB, such as HIV, or other areas of research where there is a clear public interest? For example, climate change and the need to decarbonize our economies, the need to protect food and water supplies in a changing world. And I think also the shift towards open access and open research highlight other important questions, very much sort of open up the discussion about the tension between academic freedom and democratic responsibility. And we have seen that to some degree in some of the sharper arguments around Plan S, which is kind of demanding that Plan S funded researchers can only publish in open access journals, which for a time made it seem as if they wouldn't be able to publish in Nature. And there were many howls of protest because of that, from researchers who felt that they wouldn't be able to publish in the journals that they wanted to publish in, or that they felt they needed to publish in order to advance their careers. Nobody protested against Plan S, saying, I will no longer be able to do world-class or groundbreaking research. I will no longer be able to publish my results. And it's because we fear the loss of the association with the journals, which we've clearly come to depend on for our mores of research assessment. And it's also opening up broader questions about equality, diversity and inclusion. Is the Academy properly representative of the society it claims to serve? We know here from Imperial, from work that we do in analysing our data for Athena Swan and for the Race Equality Charter, that is not true. The answer to that question is no, not yet. And also then it raises the question about how open should the Academy be for public scrutiny and involvement? Because if the Academy isn't properly representative of the society that it aims to serve, is it asking the right research questions, the ones that are most relevant for society at large? And I think there is an important debate to be had there. So at DORA, we've tried to articulate that, and this slide comes out of my own struggles with actually trying to talk about DORA, because research assessment is linked into other movements and shifts in culture, which include this shift towards open scholarship and include moves within higher education, which are gathering pace. And we are talking in the week of the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd, which had an energizing effect on our thinking around race equality here at Imperial and within the UK and elsewhere around the world. And so there are many intersecting themes that are synergizing and that are raising important questions. So at DORA, we're pushing for reform of research assessment, as are many other stakeholders. And at the intersection with open scholarship, it's really about thinking about the focus on, on the outputs, but not just on the papers. We want to think about the quality of the work, and we want to think about the variety of outputs. So not just papers, but data and code. But one of the other important outputs are, highly trained researchers. When it comes to thinking about equity and inclusion within research assessment, we know that there are many cases where there are biases against women, against researchers from ethnic minorities, against researchers who've got foreign sounding surnames when it comes to looking at CVs and looking at reviews of papers. So there is you know, a synergism here, which is, I think, hopefully drawing together. We're seeing an increasing overlap and shared set of values and goals here, which is about thinking anew about our research culture and placing our central preoccupation on the people within and without the research community. We have to serve both, but also then the values, the ulterior motives that drive us. So you can read a little bit more about the thinking that's driving that conception of how DORA intersects with open scholarship and equity in this blog post from last summer. Again, this is a vision. It captures hopefully a progressive movement between these intersecting ideals. But in order to make things happen, we do also then have to think about all of the constraints and the barriers and the challenges that happen within the real world. Okay, if we are to tackle the people who shrug their shoulders and say, what can you do? And so we do have to recognize that there are real constraints. So we do see increasing management of research by governments and on their behalf by national funders. And that's partly a reasonable thing, because we've seen, certainly since the end of the Second World War, that governments around the world have significantly increased the amount of public money that they spend on research and development, because they've recognized that there's real value that comes out of that. But of course they are keen to make sure that they get a return on their investment, and they want to be able to measure what are the outputs. But that can lead to over-metricization. Within universities, no university that I've, all universities are subject to financial and time pressures. Some are richer than others, but I don't think well, maybe in this country, I can't really speak for Oxford and Cambridge, but I certainly know that even at Imperial College, there is always, unfortunately, financial pressures, which then also lead to time pressures on busy staff when trying to sort of implement change and bring about improved practices with regard to research assessment. And I think within our own community, we still do cling to these romantic notions of genius and exceptionalism and the hero researcher. And that can lead to a sort of undue and unwarranted focus on only funding the excellent researcher or the very best researchers, and not recognizing that actually the research community is mostly made up of very intelligent people, the vast majority of whom are not exceptional or are not geniuses. And I think we need to recognize the cultural impacts that can have. That can lead to the pressure on seeking high achievement can lead to bullying and exploitation of staff. When it comes to management by governments, then at this intersection, the influx of marketization and competition to some degree is healthy, but when it is taken to extremes, it becomes hyper competition and very unhealthy. So together, these different factors rooted in either the individual, the institution, or the government lead, in my view, to sector-wide risk aversion. No one university wants to break free of university league tables. There's a loss of vision because we end up sort of chasing the league tables and not chasing what really matters to society, and a culture of overwork, which I think anyone working at a university in the UK would recognise. So let me tell you a little bit about what DORA is and what it's doing to try and address some of these really very difficult problems. It is perhaps best known as a declaration, and the primary paragraph in the declaration is about not using journal-based metrics such as impact factors as a surrogate measure for the quality of individual research articles or to assess an individual's contributions in hiring, promotion, or funding decisions. And so it is best known perhaps in those negative terms, But in fact, the declaration, if you read the whole thing, and it's available here to read, actually has 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders. So for example, for institutions, it's about being explicit about the criteria that you use and focusing on the scientific content of a paper much more than any publication metrics. And also then speaking to this point about thinking about more broadly about what research outputs are valuable. So all of them, data sets and software, but other impact measures, including qualitative indicators of research impact, such as influence on policy or practice, therapeutic practice being an obvious one. So the declaration was first published in 2013, and since then over 17,000 individuals and over 2,000 organizations have signed the declaration. For a long time, it was run out of the back office of the American Society for Cell Biology, who remain a strong supporter of us. But in 2017, we managed to attract significant new financial support, and these are our current member organizations, all of whom have given various quantities of money to help support the organization. And with that support, we've now been able to hire 1.2 members of staff, so one full-time program director, Anna Hatch, who works out of Washington, 20% of the time from Helen Sitar, who works normally at EMBO, which is listed as one of our supporters. And we now also have funding for an intern who helps us as well. So we're a very lean organization. We have also set up we have a steering group and a global advisory board, all of whom are volunteers. So this is the members of the steering group. There's about a dozen of them. Our advisory board we're very proud of, because we have very deliberately gone out to try and get representation from all parts of the globe, and we have members from all continents of the world, because tackling the problem of research assessment really has to be an international endeavour. So with our new sort of funding and new organization, we've set ourselves a roadmap, which is to recruit more signatories, because it's about spreading the word about DORA. But we also want to extend the global and disciplinary impact, and that was one of the right reasons for setting up the new advisory board. But also then our primary focus really is not just about collecting signatures and telling people, no, you mustn't use impact factors. We're very much trying to be much more practically focused on developing and promoting best practice in research assessment. Now, we are still very much a small organization, and so there are things that we can and cannot do. We sometimes get asked to police compliance to the declaration, and the scale of our organization means that we're simply not in a position to do that. We do, however, encourage all new organizational signatories to state publicly what DORA means for them and their procedures, and that is a way of empowering staff within those institutions to challenge any deviation from DORA principles. We will query public statements that come out of institutions, from institutions that have signed that appear to deviate from the spirit of DORA, and we challenged the ETH in Zurich a year or so ago on the publication of a job advert, which placed a very heavy emphasis on publishing in high impact factor journals. That turned out to be a misunderstanding, but it also created an opportunity for the organization to renew their organizational-wide commitment or communication about why they had signed DORA and what that meant for them. We're very much focused on sharing and developing good practice and working with organizations to guide implementation, because we recognize this is very much a non-trivial process. So just to give a couple of examples, these are sort of briefing documents that we've produced in the past year or so, helping to sort of articulate design principles around what good practice in research assessment looks like. And then this is a briefing about how to address unintended biases that crop up in research assessment. We've done a lot more work in organizing workshops at meetings and even running meetings by ourselves, and this was one that we hosted in October 2019 in the before times in conjunction with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So that was held in North America, and that was looking at the how to identify and overcome and barriers within institutions seeking to change their practices around research assessment. And the findings and conclusions and insights from that meeting and from other practices around the world are summarized in this paper here, which we hope creates a framework for action, so which is about for institutions understanding the obstacles to change. We wanted to encourage people to experiment with different approaches because we know this is uncharted territory, and so we want to encourage innovation and risk-taking. We want to make sure that institutions create a shared vision when revising policies and practices so they have buy-in from their institutional community, and also we would certainly encourage institutions then to communicate that vision to their institutions, but also beyond, to help stimulate the sector as a whole. So we, over Christmas last year, we revamped our website, and so we now have a much better organized resource library. So this is helping to highlight good practice as we've discovered it around the world. We also work with other organizations, again, to try and sort of maximize the value that we get out of our very small staff. So we collaborated with the Royal Society in the process of developing a resume for researchers. So this is a type of structured narrative CV, which is helping to place more of a focus on qualitative aspects of what people have actually done in a concise format that means then that panels and reviewers are not overwhelmed or overburdened by enormous amounts of data. And this is a template that is now being adopted by UKRI for all of its funding mechanisms through the UK research councils. There are different ways that that can be constructed. The resume for researchers is modular, and different institutions can perhaps choose different modules. There are other templates around. A very good one, which you can find in our resource library, is the Charité University Hospital in Berlin, where one of the attributes that they are looking to reward and incentivize are individual researchers' contributions to open science. We've also consulted and collaborated with the Wellcome Trust, whose funding policy now requires that researchers applying for funding to the Wellcome Trust must be working at an institution that has either signed and implemented DORA or done something equivalent. So that is helping to drive change, because funders have a very important role in this process. One other resource that we have developed recently, and this is again in collaboration with the European Universities Association and Spark Europe, is a series of case studies of different universities which have actually undertaken or embarked upon processes of improving their research assessments. So this is really giving the details and highlighting both the problems that they encountered and how they have overcome them, and the innovations that they have undertaken in order to drive improvements in research assessment. Finally, one of the most recent things that we have been involved in was in preparing this working paper for a meeting of the Global Research Council. And this was a sort of pre-meeting held back in November last year in anticipation of a sort of a worldwide gathering of national funders, which actually takes place later this week. And it helped to get the concept or the idea of responsible research assessment onto the agenda for the Global Research Council. And this is attempting to articulate within our practices of research assessment the values and the culture that we would really like to see, reflecting, we want to incentivize, reflect and reward the plural characteristics of high quality research. And it's envisioned, that this should open up the range of contributions that are recognized and be a step towards detoxifying our hypertoxic and hyper-competitive culture. So this, I hope, is that there will be a further step forward this week, but each of them, of course, is only a minor step, and we are by no means arrived at our utopia. How do we get to our utopia, our vision of a well-constructed and positive research assessment culture? Well, there is a handbook on it written by the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, Utopia for Realists. If we want to change the world, we need to be unrealistic, unreasonable and impossible. And I agree with that to an extent, but I also think that we have to be realistic, reasonable, and think about what's possible. So so that we take one step at a time. I'm maybe perhaps philosophically more inclined to share the perspectives of Atul Gawande, who's an excellent researcher, clinician, and writer. And I commend to you this article from the New Yorker that he wrote, which is, I think, freely accessible, which is about how you get to how do you change people's minds? How do you persuade them to change what they do? We yearn for frictionless technological solutions, which is what we would like for research assessment, but I don't think that there are ones that are frictionless and technological. It's people talking to people is how the world's standards change, which is what I've in part been doing this morning, and I encourage you to go out and do off your own bat after this meeting. So with that, I will shut up, and I'll be very happy to answer questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Ooh,
that's brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant. Yes. Thank you so much. There's so much for us to really reflect on and think about and take forwards. And I have, before today's talk, I did have a look at the DORA website, and there is just so much on there now for researchers to use and consider. So I really do encourage everyone to go and have a look at the website. So we've got quite a few questions that have come in, and there's like a real, I suppose.
Oh, I've lost you, Nadia, for a second.
I hugely enjoyed this talk. Oh, can you hear me now?
I can, yes, yeah.
She says, I hugely enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for such an exciting and thoughtful presentation. You mentioned that preprints are good for speed of dissemination, which I agree is a great feature, and I like preprints a lot. However, I also think that a huge benefit of the open science movement is that it prompts us to rethink the idea that science should be fast and/or efficient. Do you think there may be a tension there? Should we be encouraging speed of dissemination or slow science, or can both coexist?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would like to think that both can coexist. You know, when it comes to a worldwide pandemic, then I do think speed is of the essence, and so the quicker we can share results and either pull them apart and realize actually no, there's something wrong with this isn't the way to go, or build on them, then you know that's clearly important. And we should be, you know, and again I guess the point I was making is that, you know, too often our you know, our normal processes of, you know, peer review and chasing journals mean that we are not tacitly agreeing to introduce delays which I think are unnecessary into the publication process. But yes, slow research and creating space for research that does not have an immediate application, then definitely we want to make sure that there is space for that. I think in the UK, you know, it has been possible over the past 5 or 10 years to actually have a reasonable conversation, even with government and with government ministers, about the need to sort of have a balanced portfolio, because there are many good things that come out of science that were never predicted in the first place and that you could never write into a grant proposal. And so it's important to have space both for blue skies, curiosity-driven research, and research that is definitely more targeted at immediate societal needs. But again, that's a conversation that I would like to be open. So it's not one that the scientific community should dictate, although very much I'm a believer in peer review, but I would like to see opportunities created for public involvement in discussing what, you know, they see as what's important to them. And I think, you know, that could be a very valuable and intelligent exchange. I think some scientists maybe look down and think that the public are involved, it'll just become a beauty contest, but I think that's massively underestimating the public.
Yeah, I do agree with that sentiment. I think it does perhaps would underestimate the public. But do you think then that we have a bit of a problem in also how we disseminate science, and that we end up with some, you know, scientific celebrities, if you like, that can lead to that can lead the public, but also we have in a positive way, but we also have ones that perhaps misinform the public, and there has been a misinformation issue, I suppose, throughout this pandemic.
I think there has, and there have been some troublesome episodes in which some scientists have, I guess, not distinguished themselves. And I'm thinking, I guess, maybe primarily of those that were involved in the so-called Barrington Declaration, which was, very much a sort of lockdown skeptic view. I think it nevertheless was fairly clear within social media and within the media at large that that was a minority view that didn't adhere to the consensus. There has to be room for debate and discussion, and it's we're sort of getting into very dangerous times at the moment on a range of issues, with having people talking about cancel culture and not even wanting to hear the other point of view. And I think actually that's one of the strengths that openness does bring. There is a risk, of course, that you will get bad faith actors entering that space. But my sense of the scientific community is that the vast majority of researchers are actually good faith actors, and so will challenge minority views that are perhaps motivated for the wrong reasons. But it's definitely a difficult area, and actually there have been some great people on Twitter who have really taken the fight, as it were, to the skeptics, and I take my hat off to those that have really had the energy and chops for that.
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a few that I follow, and it's amazing, their perseverance. So I suppose this relates, a question from John Tregning, is how to maintain quality. Editors and journals play a role in quality control. So the shift to preprints during COVID hasn't been without problem. The reporting of unreviewed data has led to some misleading and incorrect stories.
That's true, but there have been notable cases where poor quality preprints have been exposed and unmasked very rapidly. It's also the case that poor quality research has been published in peer-reviewed journals, including The Lancet. And so I think, we do need to be careful about the trust and faith that we place in peer review. I still believe it's an important exercise. And I think on balance, it does help to improve the version of record that eventually comes out. But again, coming back to this point that I think most researchers are good faith actors, I think most of them put their heart and soul into their preprints. And certainly from my own perspective, and when I hit submit on a preprint, I'm even more nervous about doing that than previously when I was just submitting it to the journal, because you would always kind of know that, well, if the peer reviewer catches a few stupid things in the manuscript, I'll have a chance to fix them before it goes public. Whereas with a preprint, any mistake like that is on me. So actually, I was even more careful, I found, when I was actually publishing as preprints than submitting to a journal. And I think I don't know. I have to say, I mean, maybe John knows, but I don't know of good studies that have looked at the quality of peer review at different journals. And there is a presumption, I think, that the sort of high impact factor journals do better peer review than others. And I would really like to see the evidence for that. Because as a peer reviewer myself, I review for a whole range of journals, and I would like to think that I bring the same kind of professionalism, irrespective of the title or the impact factor of the journal.
It would be very interesting to see. I don't know whether anything has been done like that. I think there's been a lot to show that that the quality of research isn't necessarily better in the high impact factor journals, but whether that's a result of peer review or not is different.
I mean, it is a tricky issue, and I think it's true that on average, a paper in Nature or Science or Cell is going to be more interesting, more impactful than the sort of a paper in the British Journal of this or that, to pick a random example. But that's not going to be true of every paper in Nature or every paper in the British Journal of this or that. And when it comes to research assessment, I think we have to remember that we are dealing with individual people and individual pieces of work. And I think when we're coming to assessment, we do have to keep that at the forefront of our mind, and falling back on, oh, well, it's in Nature, therefore it must be good. On average, that will be true. In every particular case, that won't be true. So we owe it to our colleagues, I think, to do a good job of assessing them.
So John has responded to say that is a good question about quality of peer review, and he doesn't have anything off the top of his head, so we'll have to look for that. From someone anonymous, he says, do you think, they've said, do you think that any one university will eventually break free from the league tables, and do we need that to happen? Someone has followed up, Nick Holmes has followed up saying that Birkbeck Uni has left the UK league tables, but is still in the international ones. This is a question that I had, but can you imagine a future perhaps where Imperial would step outside of the league tables?
I'm afraid I can't, I have to say, given some of the conversations that I've heard about this topic. And I think there is a genuine difficulty, I think, and people do say, yeah, we know that league tables are flawed. Even the Times Higher, markets itself as one of the more robust ones, but even in the Times Higher, something like 35 or 40% of the score that you get is basically people's opinions of the university. Okay, now we are told these people are experts, but we don't know who they are. We don't know the gender balance or the sort of ethnic makeup of this group of individuals. And we imagine that most of what they know about the university, they've kind of read about. And so all you're really getting is a sort of self-reinforcing mechanism. So, I think people place an awful lot, too much trust in these measures. But it is true that they do have a very powerful influence. Students do look at them, and attracting students is an important activity for universities. It's how they keep the show on the road. I think it would be, it shouldn't be impossible for groups like the Russell Group or the League of European Research Universities to maybe collectively challenge the use of rankings. I would at the very least like to see some sort of health warning placed on the way that universities advertise themselves. If you look at Imperial's website, you can very easily find a page on league tables or rankings, okay? And that just lists where we are on the various different league tables. But there's no qualification there that, there are many other things that we do that we think are important and valuable that are not captured in league tables, and that we should at the very we should see any performance in league tables simply as a byproduct, not as a goal in itself. And so that's where I think there's more scope for kind of shifting the conversation to that. We believe ourselves to be a world-leading university. Well, let's show some leadership on this, would be my message.
Yeah. It would be good to just see some sort of more granularity, I suppose, and focus on what it is that we value, and so that people can, I suppose, make more informed choices about what universities really are and what really is world leading and excellent. So we're coming up to the hour now, but there's one question that I think relates to some of the other comments, and it's got a bit of a preamble, so I'll read it out. Just from Rodri. He says, I'm a little worried about the rise in preprints without corresponding changes to academic culture. I'm not sure COVID-19 is an unproblematic success story of the power of preprints. Though I also agree with David that peer-reviewed journals are too often not effective in quality control. But the fast publication of tentative results via preprints might do the exact opposite to the rigour of the literature that we want. The increasing volume of apparently relevant research on any question will inevitably increase the time required to actually critically scrutinise the literature. Preprints are also often cited before being peer-reviewed, and this may well lead to increasing levels of non-peer-reviewed literature shaping understanding. It is well established in the bibliometrics literature that a small fraction of all citations directly critique the reference paper. So unless researchers change their practices on how they reference, then I'm sceptical preprints will improve error detection or self-correction in science. Finally, I'm increasingly seeing scientists reporting long lists of preprints on their CVs, and this will likely increase pressure to publish and competition in academia if this becomes the norm. So I'm a little worried about preprints without corresponding changes to academic culture. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on how DORA will seek to address hyper-competition and quality in science.
Gosh, there's a lot there. How long have we got? I mean, it's true that, preprints are not an unalloyed good. Okay, there are risks associated with them. But it is, certainly within the scientific community, and I would hope within the media at large, it is recognized these are not peer-reviewed contributions. Okay. Now, there are sometimes that is not emphasized enough when they are reported in the press, and that can lead to concerns about the spread of misinformation. Nevertheless, I think the openness of it does permit scrutiny because people can just access them, but in a way that you cannot with subscription journals. So they don't have the worldwide access. Here at Imperial, we have, huge access because we are a wealthy university, but that's not the norm even for every university in the UK, never mind the rest of the world. I think, people citing preprints in their CVs, actually, that's a helpful thing, particularly for early career researchers, because often they're not in control of when sort of work is then finally published in a journal, but they are on short-term contracts and they need to get another job. And if they have a preprint, then the reviewer can actually look it up and see what they've done, rather than just, having the slightly incredible line, submitted to Nature, associated with the title in your CV, which nobody really believes anyway. Preprint actually gives you a much more tangible thing to point to, and the fact that if people are citing preprints, then again, hopefully they have the confidence that actually that's a valuable thing to do, because they know that people can look at it and can decide for themselves whether or not they think that is a substantive contribution. So and the other research worth noting is, I think, that analyses that have been done of the text between a preprint and the final peer-reviewed published version shows that in most cases 95% of the text is the same. So peer review, it does help, but in many cases, in my view, it's adding 5, 10, 15% to the value of the published work, and that actually most of the value is there in the preprint. So yes, there are risks. There will be bad science will get disseminated through preprints, but that happens anyway through journals as things stand.
Brilliant, thank you. I think I'm gonna we're coming up to time now, so I've got one last question because it's one that I feel like I've got a very strong answer to, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. So this is from Mawesh. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I haven't. They say, would appreciate your thoughts on the apparent trade-off between research excellence and a positive research culture, a false dichotomy.
It absolutely is a false dichotomy. Okay, so what we have seen, and what we've seen when we look around the academy and the academic staff, both at Imperial and across Europe and across the world, is the impacts of systemic exclusion of women, of people from ethnic minorities, and it is in no way. And in fact, when I come across this view, and I do come across it from certain individuals who feel challenged by any moves to try and diversify things, they think, oh, it's political correctness gone mad. Okay, it is absolutely not. Okay, it is the fact that we have a system that is not good at recognizing genuine talent, whether that talent is embodied by a woman or by a person of color. And so, we do see the effects of systemic racism, and we are throwing talent away, or we are busy turning it away at the gates. And so I'm very much of the view that the drive to diversity is actually synergistic with the drive to improve not just the excellence and the quality of our researchers, but also the relevance of the research and the research questions that we conduct.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we need to draw to a close now because we're at time. So there was quite a lot of, I've published everyone's comments in the Q&A because there's quite a lot of chat, and people have shared links to articles. So I encourage everyone to have a look through. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sure we will continue the conversation. It's not over. we haven't got to our utopia yet, but we're certainly working towards it. So thank you for everyone for joining, for all your questions. Imperial riots looks like we're drawing to a close for the summer, but I'm hoping that we will have a last-minute edition towards the end of June, so keep watching on Twitter for that. And otherwise, there's the full riots programme still going, so have a look online for that. So I'll end this now. If Professor Curry, you stay on so we can just close. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for all your questions.